Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's webinar entitled Enterprise Level Social Media Strategy. Today's conversation is brought to you by Cision and powered by OnStream Media. To submit a question or comment at any time during the webinar, please click on the Ask a Question button on the bottom of your screen. Simply type your message into the box and click on the Submit button. Alternatively, you can ask a question on Twitter using the hashtag Cision. You can also download a copy of today's presentation by clicking on the Download Presentation in the bottom of your screen. At this time, it is my pleasure to turn the floor over to today's host, Heidi Sullivan, Senior VP of Cision. Heidi, the floor is now yours.
Great. Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. We're excited to have you today. And as a complete fan, I am super excited to introduce our speaker today. Rebecca Lieb is a strategic advisor, research analyst, keynote speaker, author, and columnist. Her areas of specialization are digital marketing and media with a concentration in content strategy, content marketing, and converged media, all the great stuff that we're all worried about today and trying to figure out. So she works with many of the world's leading brands on digital marketing innovation. Clients range from startups to nonprofits to Fortune 100 brands and regulated industries, including Facebook, Home Depot, Nestle, Anthem, Adobe, Honeywell, DuPont, Fidelity, and I can go on. Earlier, she was Altimeter Group's digital advertising and media analyst, where she published what remains the largest extant body of research on content marketing, content strategy, and content's role in paid, owned, and earned media. For those of you who are not familiar with her research at Altimeter Group, I will confess as a complete fan that I probably quote the converged media imperative at least weekly. In fact, I have a copy of it on my desktop so I can quickly pull up the workflow that Rebecca is going to share with you today. Even though it's a few years old, I constantly call it the new job description for all of us as communications and marketing professionals. Prior to that, she was VP at eConsultancy, where she launched the company's U.S. operations and grew the business to profitability in 1 year. She was VP and editor-in-chief of the ClickZ Network for over 7 years, and for part of that time also ran SearchEngineWatch.com. Again, she frequently speaks publicly on topics about digital marketing, advertising, and media, and if that wasn't enough in her copious free time, she writes books. The Truth About Search Engine Optimization became an Amazon bestseller, and it was followed by Content Marketing, one of the first books on that topic, and a must-read. So with that, welcome, Rebecca. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, Heidi, I'm completely blushing. Thank you for such an effusive introduction, and I'm going to turn the tables and congratulate you for a stunning achievement. Cision rebranded today, and the new site looks great. So thank you to everybody who's joined the webinar, and I encourage you to check out the website because it's always exciting and it's an amazing amount of heavy lifting to get a project like that off the ground. So again, thanks everyone for spending your lunch hour with us, or if you're on the West Coast, maybe your brunch hour. And I wanted to set the stage today and discuss building an enterprise social strategy from the perspective that I'm most comfortable at, from a research-based perspective. I always like to ground ideas in research. So I'm going to outline where I see the state of things for about half an hour, and then Heidi and I are going to go into a Q&A period in which we're going to discuss with each other and also discuss with you what your questions, what your observations are about building an enterprise social strategy now. I'm certainly seeing a lot of changes in the landscape. I know that Cision is going to make this deck available to you after the presentation, so sit back, relax, and don't take too many notes if you don't feel like it. I will make the deck available on my SlideShare account, and much of the research that I'm going to be discussing in this presentation is available on my personal website as well. So feel free to help yourself to deeper background. I'm also going to be citing the research of some of my former colleagues at Altimeter Group, most particularly credit due to Ed Turpinning, who just published a State of the Industry report. So let's dive in. After discussing the state of the industry today, I would like to go back to converged media, which I think is influencing very heavily where social strategy is going, and then talk a little bit about staffing and leadership in enterprise organizations insofar as social is concerned. I'm seeing enormous changes in that sector going on right now. And finally, get into some of the success criteria for establishing social at the enterprise level. And then, of course, we'll get on to that Q&A period. So if there's one overarching term I'd like you to bear in mind right now when you're thinking about social on the enterprise level, it's that integration is the goal. But we're seeing disconnects throughout the enterprise and throughout different marketing silos that are really hindering the advancement and the sort of holistic nature of social as it should exist in the enterprise today. So let's go into where we are today with enterprise social strategy. Again, credit due for Ed Turpinning. This is some new survey data that he just published. So we're finding that digital integration and content strategy are the top enterprise priorities right now. But there is an enormous lack of strategy for integrating social into this larger digital picture. My research in content strategy jives with the research conducted by several other individuals and organizations that 76% of companies lack a content strategy, and 82% of enterprises want to integrate social and digital this year, but only 36% have a plan to do so. So we're finding that there is an enormous separation between the will and finding the way. Yet 55% of strategists say integrating social and digital is a top priority, which is almost more than double the increase of that number from 2013. All in all, and I think you're going to find some congruence in these findings, social is really stopping its existence as a separate, distinct business silo. And social is increasingly being seen, particularly by the C-suite, as another part of digital, and a part of digital that is going to have to play nicely with all of its brethren. But in order to do this, you have to break down the silos. You have to break down silos between paid, owned, and earned media. Social media is, of course, earned media, as are communications and public relations. And again, working with executives to integrate social has grown 1.5 times since 2013. But the disconnect here, and there are so many disconnects, is that only about a quarter of companies are saying that their executives are involved in this kind of integration. And C-suite involvement has dropped almost 20% since 2012. Independently of these findings, I'm working as right this moment on research that's going to publish in a couple of weeks, and I'm doing an analysis of what CMOs are discussing in social media and in social channels. And one of the marketing-related topics that's taken the biggest drop in 2015 as opposed to 2014 is social media as a separate and distinct topic. Content marketing has seen the greatest increase as a marketing discipline that they're discussing, followed by global marketing, and social is really taking a nosedive. So getting the C-suite to recognize social as a separate and distinct entity is going to be an increasing problem unless social is more closely aligned with digital, with paid media, with content marketing, and with overall marketing efforts. Meanwhile, employee advocacy is on the rise, and employee-focused initiatives need partnership in human resources and in hiring and in other parts of the organization. There are legal concerns about getting employees involved in social initiatives. There's training concerns. About double of the companies that were trying to leverage employee advocacy has occurred over the past 2 years. But again, only less than a fifth of those companies say that HR is regularly engaged with the social team on strategy and education and legal and putting guardrails into place so that these initiatives are not just effective, but don't actually endanger the enterprises that are trying to leverage employees in a positive and proactive way. Social ad budgets, meanwhile, are going through the roof. Another huge argument for integration. I was on a panel the other night with the head of content for Johnson & Johnson, who's, when I asked her what the biggest change had been over the past year at J&J, a regulated industry, I might add, it's healthcare, she said that the company was doubling their social advertising spending. And we're seeing that across the board. We're seeing a 205% increase in social ad spend since 2013. Yet another clarion call for integration, right? Because this isn't just earned media anymore. Social has collided and is now sort of irretrievably melded to paid media. So the social people have to be able to talk to the ad people and talk to the media people. But unsurprisingly, we've got another disconnect here. Only a third of organizations say that their ad teams are regularly engaged with their social teams, even though the spending budget has doubled. And dare I say it, there's a bit of a tug of war. There is some competition over who owns the space rather than the cooperation that you would want to foster and that you would expect. So Heidi cited some of my work in converged media as an impetus for this, and let's dig in and look at why this is happening. We've got paid media, which is advertising. This is traditional buying or renting time or space in order to place a message. Owned media is content marketing in its purest form. It is media that you create and that you put on platforms that you own or largely control. So these could be social platforms, these could be your blog, your own company website, or a microsite. Earned media is what we term social media. It's asking for shares, it's asking for audience interaction, it's asking for likes, retweets, opinions, but we're seeing all three of these types of media, paid, owned, and earned, come together in different ways. We're seeing promoted brand content on social platforms. That's where this doubling of social ad spending is coming in. We're seeing native advertising, which I define as paid plus owned media. It's when you pay a media property to promote your own content editorially, very, very often with a strong social component. And this is where integration becomes critical. You can't just have the content people working in one wing of the building, the advertising people working in another, and the social and the PR people working in their own silo. All of these players, all of these channels, all of these teams are going to have to come together, cooperate, integrate, and work towards shared, unified goals. And in addition to all of these different media coming together, we're seeing an incredible proliferation of channel, platform, and media complexity. This is a slide for plotting the content marketing ensemble. In paid media, there are a whole number of channels. Owned has another. Earned has yet a third, and arguably earned media, which is social media, has the fastest growing new family of sites as new social platforms continue to proliferate. The ones mentioned in the bullets on this slide are only the top ones in the space. And then, of course, you have different media types: text, graphic, long form, microform, audiovisual, apps and games. All of these different types and forms of media can be broken up, made recombinant, and pushed out to other media platforms in other form factors, reused, repurposed, and tested and amplified throughout these channels of paid, owned, and earned. So earned social media, again, is no longer operating in a silo. It's connected with this entire chain of media and platforms. So to that end, and this is something Heidi cited at the beginning of this conversation, we're seeing a new workflow emerge. We used to see paid media, which was advertising, emerge as the boss of all forms of marketing and communication. Because advertising cost the most, because it necessitated a media buy, it ruled the roost, and campaigns lasted maybe 6 weeks, maybe 8 weeks, and then they were over, and you could go back to your desk and regroup and decide what the next thing was. We're now finding that the entire workflow in marketing is different thanks to content strategy and converged media. So rather than see things begin with advertising, we're seeing the workflow begin with content strategy over here on this slide at about 1 o'clock. Content is pushed across channels, and you watch and measure and monitor very carefully to see what works. What are audiences engaging in? What do they care about? What do they like and what do they share? What do they consume? What makes them come back for more? When you see what they're engaging in, you can then amplify that type of content, constantly iterating and testing it in real time along the way. And only after you've vetted this content in earned channels and also in owned channels do you invest in it and restructure it and turn it into paid advertising. So paid has gone from being the top of this strategic heap to literally being the bottom. And then rather than ending at the end of 6 or 8 weeks, this is an iterative process that involves constant lather, rinse, and repeating. It's never over. And the social strategist needs to be part of every phase of this process, not just down there at 6 o'clock at engagement and amplification. And that's why, just to reiterate, we're seeing social ad budgets increase, in fact, almost double. And that's why social teams need to be very, very closely connected with their colleagues in paid media and also in content. So what does this mean strategically inside of the organization? Who leads this? Who follows? Who's the boss of it? It is getting a little bit complicated. Strategists need leaders in order to cross these silos and integrate, but increasingly we're seeing the C-suite kind of shrug and look away from social. What are social teams to do in order to integrate into these teams and seize control of their own destiny? We're seeing different enterprise models for social organization, highly centralized, highly distributed, very holistic. But what we're really seeing is right in the middle, most companies are going for the hub and spoke model, a central governing body with many different satellites outside. And the satellites are increasingly necessary because companies need to have a culture of content, an engine of content, in order to keep culling the raw material for all of this content that's going to go out across paid, owned, and earned media. We know that all the stories don't just reside in marketing or in advertising. Stories come from the sales floor. Stories come from sales associates. Stories might come from the call center or the call desk. research and development, from product groups, from human resources, from any aspect of the organization, particularly those that are outwardly facing and in contact with clients, vendors, and partners. So it's very important for social to have tentacles or eyes and ears in all of these different organizational areas of a company. And we're seeing all of this begin to coalesce around content strategy and content marketing, because content is the raw material that fuels social networks, social platforms, and social strategy, just as content is what is fueling advertising. I always like to say in advertising they call content creative because it's more expensive, but really it's just more content. And so organizations are now challenged to build this machine that can help to identify content and disseminate content and turn content into fodder for all of these various channels and initiatives and campaigns. How are they doing it? It's really difficult. Companies need to organize for content marketing and content strategy, and rather than deflect the conversation from social, this is actually very much a conversation that social is leading. When I work with organizations that say, help us to develop a content strategy, 9 times out of 10 that call is coming from the social media department, because that is the department challenged with feeding the hungriest beast, with needing the most content on a daily basis. Secondarily, I'm seeing that call come up from communications divisions, because they have the second biggest beast to feed when it comes to constantly creating and disseminating and publishing content. So I've identified 6 different content models that companies are adopting in the real world. There's been a lot of call from content gurus and content experts for chief content officers, but this is a role that is very, very rare and very, very exceptional, mainly because boards of directors don't want to hire new C-level executives. So what I'm seeing are 2 essential ways of governing this type of content. Either there are boards or councils or centers of excellence, these are committees, or these are executives that either run a content department or division, a cross-functional content chief, or titles within the organization and increasingly have the word editor or content in the title. But somebody and something has to govern all of this content, make sure people are aware of it, and make sure that it is being used to its fullest advantage. So what are the success criteria for an organization trying to integrate, trying to wrap its arms around an enterprise social strategy? First, people. People are what create this content. People are who have the conversations. And, of course, people are ultimately who you're communicating with, be they customers, be they prospects, be they vendors, partners. It's who you need to bring into a social strategy to make it human and make it real. This is senior leadership, getting the C-suite involved, EVPs, SVPs, but it's also looking out to domain leaders, the people in the call center, the people in human resources, in R&D, and in product, who are going to be able to help you to craft the stories and identify the pain points that all of this social strategy is going to address. You have to be in touch with different business units, and you have to understand not just what you want from them, but what they want from you. You have to make this a value exchange, not just for your audience, but also for the other participants within the organization. External partners are critical in this. This can be your supply chain partners, your agency partners. They're all going to have points of view. They're all going to have different perspectives, and they're all going to ultimately be able to help you shape better messaging and better stories, providing you know how to listen to them. And finally, your employees can be terrific advocates, either as employee advocates and not just necessarily the content creators or the people who are going to be engaged in social media, although certainly some of your employees are going to be able to do that. But don't overlook the employees who aren't creators, but who nonetheless are pathfinders who can lead you to what is going to be the next great campaign and the next great story. Not everybody can produce it, but a lot of people have a nose for it. Processes are the second great foundation of social strategy. You have to continually evangelize social. What's its benefit? How can people participate? Why does it work? How can it help me to achieve my goals, perhaps my goals in another area of the company outside of social or outside of marketing? Can you tell HR how a social strategy is going to help them recruit and retain better staff? Can you go to customer service and say, maybe we can craft a strategy that brings less calls into the call center, and at a lower price point we can direct help to Twitter or Facebook or another lower price point way of dealing with customer relations. Education and training is critical to this. You also, if you're involving employees, have to make them understand what the gray areas are in social. You can't really teach black and white, but you can help them know where not to tread when talking about the company on social platforms. And then finally, but last but certainly not least, there's technology. What tools are you going to use to help you do this most effectively? And again, this goes back to education and training. How are you going to get the necessary employees on board with those platforms so that you can work effectively and also measure results and understand results effectively? And if you get that right, the people and the processes, it's not the easiest thing to fine-tune, and it's a constant iterative process. You will be working in concert and in harmony, not just within the social group, but within the broader marketing function of the enterprise and also the broader enterprise as a whole. And that is absolutely your goal when you build an enterprise social strategy. And with that, I'm going to invite Heidi to join us again so we can discuss some of this and also entertain some of her questions as well as some of your questions. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. That was all very fascinating and informative. And I think in summary, it just means that an enterprise social strategy is a piece of cake, right? But I think as we start to look at this discussion, and for those of you listening, please feel free to submit some questions in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. But to kick it off, with a lot of these different org models that we discussed, whether it's a CCO or whether it's a hub and spoke model, and regardless, from your perspective, what's the most common enterprise org model for social and content? And then at the same time, Rebecca, what's the most successful?
The most common model we're seeing is the hub and spoke model in social. So central alignment, a center of excellence, a central department, but then feelers out to other divisions. But increasingly, we're seeing this hub and spoke model incorporate content and not just social in some capacity. And this is a trend I think we're going to see increase dramatically in the year 2016. And not just in terms of the people and the job descriptions in the organization. It's a trend I'm seeing on the software side as well. We're seeing the content software vendor landscape begin to absorb the social media landscape. And this isn't a negative. This isn't like a bigger fish is eating a smaller, weaker fish. This is a natural marriage of the two parts of marketing that need and use and create and disseminate and publish and analyze and govern the most content. So I'm seeing a real convergence, not just of media, but most specifically of content and of social on both the people and the process level.
Very interesting. Jennifer has a question here, and I think this really, I know you touched on this with legal concerns, but clearly there are other reasons there are concerns as well. She says there's some fear and caution among leadership, C-suite, HR, when it comes to social. Do you have any suggestions on how to bring alignment for increased engagement with the social team?
You can't eliminate risk. You can only mitigate risk, and part of a social strategy is to have a plan in place so that when something happens, there are processes and procedures and you know which way to go. Very often this is as simple as a triage chart. Did a comment come in? Is it positive? Here's the next step. Is it negative? Here's the next step. Organizations from the U.S. Army to the major tech giants all have this mapped out in their social strategies and social planning so that everybody involved in the social process knows exactly what to do when and I'm speaking hypothetically now, United breaks guitars. You know who to call, you know who to get approvals from, you know what you're allowed to do as an individual and as an organization. So no organization is going to ever eliminate risk in social media. This is part of why social media is so resonant and so important, because it's so human, and being human is being messy. You're just going to have a stomach for risk and make a plan so that the reward outweighs the risk, and know how to identify and triage a bad situation before it happens rather than during the fallout.
Absolutely. And, I think from experience what we've seen is that people are going to be talking about you regardless if you're there or not. So being able to mitigate risk creates more opportunity than not doing anything at all. We have a question from Paula, and she's actually also on Twitter talking about how social ad spend, the fact that it's increased over 200% since 2013. And then she also mentions how Facebook APIs have changed that have significantly decreased organic reach. So her questions really come about how social ad spending has affected organic content and reach. Do you think Twitter will follow Facebook? What are ways that we can still organically incorporate social?
One of the last few free, genuinely free ways to reach people on the Internet is organic search. Facebook, Twitter, all of these platforms are increasingly going to charge marketers. The better you are and the bigger and more devoted your following, the better you'll do. But paid is increasingly the price of entry, and it's a big reason for converged media that even companies that are doing extraordinarily well with their owned media are having to resort to a certain degree of paid promotion in order to drive traffic there. Not everybody can boast, if you build it, they will come. Increasingly, there is a monetization model for the web, and the social platforms are public companies out to make money, and they are going to increasingly charge brands and find ways to continue to do so. So the best thing to do is use your social strategy to leverage access to your content, and then hope that they will come to your content, which is your owned media, that you're at least not paying for the media buy for.
So on that note, Rebecca, as we start talking about ad spend, and you really discussing a lot of that shifting to ad spend on content, I know that you often recommend that organizations do a content audit before they embark on a new content strategy. Can you talk about a little bit about what a content audit is and why it's important?
Absolutely. So a content audit is taking a long, hard look. When I do audits for my clients, I look at a 50-plus point scorecard, and I look at content in every which way you possibly can, and I grade it on a scale of 1 to 5. So is it timely and original could be one criteria. Is it showing up in search is another criteria. Is it out of date? Is it timely and relevant? Is it technically in order? Are the images rendering, or is the video playing? And it's this huge in-depth scorecard that looks at every aspect of your website, of your social properties, and also of the processes that you're using to create and publish content. Where are you storing your images? Are they tagged, and are they easily retrievable? And the reason to do an audit is you can't know where you're going unless you know where you are. And that first audit is always the most difficult, but it is a very, very strong benchmark for moving forward. And it's going to reveal not just what you're doing well and what you're doing badly. It can reveal a lot of gaps, like what do you do with outdated content on your properties? Do you archive it? Do you throw it away? Do you have a policy for that? It can reveal all kinds of overlooked opportunities. I was recently working for one of my clients, which is a cultural institution here in New York, and as part of the audit, I discovered that lots of searches were coming in for visiting information in languages that you would expect tourists to use, such as Spanish and French and Italian, yet every word on their website was English. So a very specific recommendation was, why don't you put visiting information up in multiple languages? Content audits can have all kinds of unexpected benefits and reveal all kinds of unexpected but incredibly valuable information, both in terms of processes, people, types of content, platforms used. You can also do competitive audits and look at what your competitors or others in your field are doing that you might learn for, might want to adapt, or might want to shy away from if you don't want to look to me too. And I recommend that businesses can conduct audits at least twice yearly across all of their owned and all of their social platforms to make sure that they are keeping their finger on the pulse of what they're really doing versus what they think they might probably be doing.
Wendy has a question that I think will be related to content audits here. She says, are there any social media platforms you feel businesses should stay away from? If so, what are they? So I guess even to add to that, as you do a content audit, what would be an indication that this is not a platform for you to focus on or that you should stay away from?
Well, part of the challenge of a content or a social strategy is identifying your audience and finding out where they are. And where they are today is not necessarily where they're going to be tomorrow or next week or a year from now. MySpace might have been central to your content, to your social strategy 6 or 8 years ago, and look at it now. So which is yet another reason to do an audit, to keep tabs of those metrics, those traffic numbers, and to ensure that where you are today is where you need to be today as opposed to where you had to be yesterday. Another thing that an audit is going to do is help you get more strategic about your decision making. We've all been in that meeting where some executive said, we need a Facebook page because everybody else has a Facebook page, which is not a strategy. It's a tactic with no attention paid to what's going to be on our Facebook page. What's the purpose of our Facebook page? How are we going to maintain a Facebook page? All very important decisions so that the entire internet isn't littered with these half-baked and quickly abandoned properties, be they Facebook pages or blogs or Instagram accounts. So it's really making sure that you have the strategic goal around what you want to achieve and how you're going to achieve it, as well as the processes in place to go forth and execute and measure and iterate and improve.
I think with social just changing and evolving so rapidly that a lot of times it is our initial instinct to say, everybody's on Snapchat, I have to be on Snapchat. And I think you're absolutely right that that's really where this content audit and strategy becomes so important to make sure that we're not just doing a Me Too strategy, but doing what's best for the bottom line and best for our business.
Absolutely, and sometimes you're not even going to have the resources to do this if you're a very lean organization and already straining to do what you have. Sometimes it's not just your audience, but it's your capabilities.
Absolutely. So let's say you've done your audit, you have your benchmarks, you have your strategy. I want to hit one of Megan's questions here, which is how do you use social media metrics to then help evangelize social to different organizational units? We were discussing earlier how important it is not just to engage the C-suite, but HR and customer service and technology and sales. What's the most important data to highlight? And she cites impressions, reach, engagement.
Data to highlight. When you're talking to other units that are not marketing, you have to keep in mind what their goals are and what their benchmarks are. So I actually recently published a report on less than obvious metrics that I'd like marketers to be keeping in mind when they do social and content marketing that are beyond sales. So often, people are tempted to just measure sales, and I'm saying just with air quotes because sales are really super important. We all know that. But I'm thinking of examples like customer service, where Sony Europe was getting a lot of calls into their call center about a very easily fixable problem consumers were having with a television set. They could resolve the issue very quickly with the callers, but their problem was that every time somebody picked up the phone and called the call center, it cost them €7, which is roughly $7. They wrote a couple of paragraphs of content about how to fix the problem, threw it up on their community site, and that piece of content got 42,000 views in 2 weeks, the first 2 weeks it was up. That translates into almost $300,000 worth of deflected calls to the call center. That's the kind of metric you can go to a call center with and say, see, we can help you do your job better. Or ESPN just recently moved out of New York City and into fairly deep into Connecticut, many miles away from the city. So there was huge employee churn, a lot of departing staff, a lot of need to hire new staff out in Connecticut. Their employees put together a site about why it's great to work for ESPN, why it's great to live in Connecticut. They were able to show measurable results of how this impacted attracting and retaining employees to ESPN. So again, these aren't necessarily marketing goals in the classic sense per se, but they have business results. They're not just volume metrics like likes and thumbs up and shares, but actual attribution to the bottom line of the way the company or the business unit operates. And that's the kind of goal or KPI you need to bake into these plans and use in evangelism when you're talking to these other departments. Another example, if I can just throw out one more, is Domino's in Australia created an app in which they encouraged users to invent and name different pizzas. But they went a step further, and they gave people commissions of those pizzas when other users ordered their pizzas. And this turned into product development. Some of those pizzas that users have developed and named have become part of Domino's permanent menu in Australia, and the inventors of these individual pizzas are reaping the financial rewards, as is Domino's, as part of a commission.
I love all three of those examples, and they vary so much. So it's exciting to see how they can apply across organizations. Going back to traditional marketing audiences, so Kenny has a different struggle, which is how can we convince skeptical senior marketing leadership that spending on social has greater potential for impact with our audience than traditional TV, radio, or print advertising?
By demonstrating that that's where your audience is, and it's easier to demonstrate measurable results from social advertising in which you can ask people to take a desired action than it is from advertising in traditional broadcast media. But there's no reason why this needs to be an either-or production. You can do both, and you can measure both channels and make decisions from there.
Great. Going back to KPIs and analytics, Paula asks if you have any experience with measuring conversions from social to content, whether it's website visits, through Google Analytics, earned traffic versus owned traffic via tweet, so on and so forth.
Well, the real reason to measure social to content and vice versa is, again, to measure actual business results from those visits. And so I would encourage you to look more deeply into those analytics. And so when I was running an editorial property a few years ago, and Twitter was still relatively new, we wanted to know the value of traffic from Twitter. So we measured the conversion, because as a publisher we were selling things like conferences and events and paid subscriptions, the likelihood of a Twitter follower converting to doing one of these things versus somebody that found us through organic search versus somebody who found us through paid search. So I would encourage you to measure those conversions and those interactions in a more business result, dollars and cents type of way. So not just the volume of people that get to your landing page because of Twitter, but what do those Twitter visitors do? And I can't say that this would still be a valid statistic, but this was 6 or 8 years ago, a Twitter visit was worth less to us than any other type of visit, from a direct referral, from paid search, from organic search, etc. That might not be the case today, but you want to know that information. So don't just measure where did they come from. That's helpful. But what did they do subsequently?
Absolutely, and I think that as an industry, we've really begun to move forward. We saw the ad tech revolution with marketing, where you really began to, instead of just looking at views, start to measure how things are impacting the bottom line. And I think frequently social and PR can be seen as a cost center because we're still struggling to get some of that measurement down and really figuring out how we can show the impact on the bottom line. So that's why I love the KPI examples that you gave earlier as well. Shifting gears a little bit back to talking about the silos, because I think when we see your slides, Rebecca, it seems like a no-brainer, right? Clearly, content teams and social teams and PR teams and marketing teams, advertising teams need to be talking to each other, but that continues to be a challenge within organizations. So Ashley describes one of those. She says, our social manager sits in marketing, but PR sits in a different group, and we're struggling to influence social content and strategies. Do you have any tips or suggestions on how to show the value of PR and social aligning and leaning on PR for content?
Really, social and PR are converging as, so many sites these days have social newsrooms, and companies are using social media as ways to communicate and just talk with their constituencies, be it the public part of public relations, media relations. Again, this is converged media. Social is part of PR. It's earned media, and earned media is PR. PR has always been social in that you go to a journalist or a media outlet and you ask for coverage. The only difference now is that you also now go straight to your audience and ask for coverage, ask for likes, ask for amplification. So the two are really inextricably bound. It's interesting because when I started talking about paid, owned, and earned as a triumvirate, I had several clients actually at some of the major PR firms who were saying that shared should be the fourth leg on that stool, and having given it much thought, I think shared is a subset of earned. But that's still a very legitimately debatable point, and you can't extricate PR and communications from social.
Well, and on that point, Ellie actually has an interesting point and question here, which is that we often think of social as, air quotes, platforms, but aren't they really media properties of the corporations and need to be managed as such?
Absolutely, they're media platforms, and what they are is containers for content, and that's why I'm pushing the ideas of content marketing and content strategy so vigorously. You know, a Facebook or a Twitter or an Instagram with no content would just be empty shells, just like email without content would be, a great big nothing. I like to say that content is the atomic particle of all marketing. Without it, you don't have social, you don't have advertising, you don't have communications, you don't have search, you don't have anything, which is why content has to be the engine that drives and unites this. And it's also why the strategic unification is so important, because consumers are increasingly losing their ability to differentiate between paid, owned, and earned channels. It's all just content. And if your brand or product or service doesn't look, feel, and smell the same and talk with the same voice in advertising as it does in social, as it does on your own website, consumers are going to disconnect and not recognize it as they look from this screen to that screen and this platform to that platform.
On our content engine, I know that earlier this summer you wrote a blog post on the difference between content and content marketing. Can you explain the key differences, and are those lines blurring?
They're starting to blur a little bit. One of the reasons that I was writing about that subject is I think there's a little bit of a disconnect between what people think of as content and what they think of as content marketing. And I'm beginning to see these positions emerge on the enterprise level as the vice president of content marketing. And this is a marketing role. But there's also a chief content officer role, and I would argue that that person would have a wider purview than a content marketer. They're responsible not just for the content that is produced, published, and disseminated for marketing purposes, but all content that a company produces and publishes. This could be internal publications. This could be product information and product documentation. So it's really much deeper and much vaster. It's the entire voice of the company. It's a really C-level position as opposed to a marketing-only proposition. And I get a little pedantic about this stuff because I'm finding there's still a lack of understanding between what, say, content marketing is versus content strategy. Maybe I'm too much of a school marm about this, but, it's a space I look at very closely, so I can get pretty nerdy about it.
Well, and I think it's such an amalgamous term, right? Content marketing. And I think a few years ago, very few of us were thinking about our content marketing strategy, but I'm not sure you would get the same definition of content marketing from 5 different people who all work in a marketing function. I think they might all have a separate definition. So I think it's important for us to continue talking about it.
I couldn't agree more, and there's never going to be complete alignment, but these are the debates that keep things interesting, aren't they?
Sure, absolutely. We're still trying to figure out whether shared is part of earned or not, or owned or not. So,
and sometimes the discussion is just as important, if not more so, than the decision.
Absolutely, and just being aware of the nuances. So the subhead of your book, Content Marketing, on the topic of content marketing, starts with Think Like a Publisher. What does thinking like a publisher look like?
Thinking like a publisher is thinking long-term, thinking in terms of goals, having a strategy and having a process in place. I find that too many people embarking in social or embarking in content marketing make the same mistakes that companies were making, 25, 30 years ago when they decided to publish a newsletter. Everybody gets around a table and thinks it's a great idea and produces a great newsletter, and then it's time for the second issue, and everybody's devoid of ideas. They've kind of blown everything they had on just the one initiative. Publishing is sustainable, and again, we're not talking about 6 or 8 week campaign flights. We're talking about very prolonged, endless initiatives. So you need the people and places to do that. You need technology. You need process. You need governance. You need goals, KPIs. Content isn't really as simple as people thought it was 5 years ago, which was hire an out-of-work journalist for $10 and a slice of pizza every week, and they'll keep this thing going. Content is now visual and audiovisual. It's in apps. It's in code. It's across dozens of platforms and dozens of form factors and screens, and it really does need substantial strategy and expertise behind it.
Absolutely. So I know we're getting close to the top of the hour. I think just in closing, for people to walk away with, one final question, Rebecca. What are 3 practical things that people listening can do after this webcast today to move their social and content strategy forward?
So number one, you said the magic word, which is strategy. You've absolutely got to have a strategy that is two-pronged. It defines why you want to do what you want to do. It outlines goals, and then it determines how you're going to measure those goals and how you're going to know if you're achieving them. Number 2, you have to select the right people and tools and processes to put into place to ensure a workable, sustainable effort towards those goals. And number 3, and this might surprise you a little, is flexibility. I think one of the things that intimidates companies and enterprises when you say you need a strategy is they think the minute they commit to that, it's immutable and they're not allowed to change it even a little tiny bit. You are allowed to change, and you are allowed to fine-tune. But if you don't have the discipline of that initial strategy and those initial metrics so that you can level set and know where you're going, you're not going to know whether to turn right or left when you hit the next fork in the road.
Excellent. Well, Rebecca, as always, you are insightful and inspiring, and it's great to have practical data behind such a challenging topic. So I can't thank you enough for joining us today and for sharing your insights. So thank you again.
It was my very great pleasure, and thank you to everybody who joined us out there. Really appreciate it, and who asked such great questions, too.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. This does conclude today's webcast. As a reminder, this event will be made available on demand shortly. We thank you for your participation. You may close your browser at this time, and have a great day.